wonderful class.
Thank you very much. Okay, welcome everyone to the 2023 Rotary Cutters with Michaels, hosted by Fiskars. I'm Dan Cunningham. I'm an engineer at Fiskars. So I've actually had a large hand in a lot of these rotary cutters, as well as some of the historical rotary cutters we've made. So over the next half hour, 40 minutes, we're going to talk about what rotary cutters are, when you might want to use them, and then some special features of a lot of the new rotary cutters that we just launched at Michaels this year. So we're very excited to be able to show off a lot of these new things that have been several years in development, and they finally made it onto store shelves. You can go out and get them now. So even though you may have seen a rotary cutter tool school up on YouTube or on the Michaels site from 2020, this is new, this is revamped. These are showing off a lot of the new and fancy things. So hopefully you'll learn something. Along the way, like was mentioned, you can enter questions into the chat. Tiffany is here with me to help out. If they aren't easily answered via chat, we will have time at the end to really address a lot of those questions that you might have about both the products and potentially their availability, and maybe some details about things that you might see in the presentation you might come up with new questions about. So without further ado, let's continue into the understanding the rotary cutters. So we're going to start out really very basic. And if you've seen a rotary cutter, you might think, oh, is that just a pizza cutter, a razor sharp pizza cutter? It turns out there really are not very many components to a rotary cutter. They are essentially, yes, razor sharp pizza cutters for cutting fabric. They really have just three components. They all have a blade, very, very sharp blade. It's round, sharpened all the way around, that will rotate as you are cutting. They have a handle or some way to hold them. There's a couple different variations of those handles, and they all have important safety features about them, because rotary blades are some of the sharpest blades out there. They're sharper than craft knives. They're sharper than scissors. They are, if you're not handling them correctly, they have the potential to injure yourself. So every rotary cutter we make has safety features, and we'll talk about some of those things. So while there are these just three basic components of a rotary cutter, there are lots of things you can mix and match between them, different kinds of handles, different sizes of blades, different ways to keep those blades safe, that give you a wide variety of options that all fall within these three basic components. So in a little more detail, if you're looking at a shelf of Michaels, you say, oh, there's a whole bunch of different rotary cutters out there. Which one would you go to choose? I mean, this is just a smattering of those things. They are basically all just mix and match of those three different components: the blades, the handles, and the safety. So we're going to break those down into look at the different kinds of blades, the different kinds of handles, and the different safety features. And then we'll come back to this slide and start to understand when, all right, I want this size blade with this handle, what are my options? So to start, there are three major sizes for the blades. These are the standard kind of three different sizes. They are measured in millimeters. There's small, medium, and large, but more specifically, there's 28 millimeters, which they fit kind of in a small, it's not too much bigger than your thumb. There's 45 millimeters, and these are really the ones that you see most frequently. They're kind of a middle size. And then there's 60 millimeters, and 60 millimeters is larger. You'll often see these, especially quilters like to use these. But there are some pros and cons to each of them. Starting with the smallest rotary cutter, again, that 28 millimeter. This is a good tool if you're going to make cuts that curve. So one characteristic of a rotary cutter is as you're cutting, it cuts through the fabric and then it digs into a mat. We'll talk about the mats in a little bit, but understand that if you try and make a curve with it, it's dug into the mat a little bit, so you won't be able to make sharp curves. And the larger the blade, the more gradual of a curve you can make. So if you have a small blade, you can make a sharper curve, or not a corner, but you could make a small curve. So these short, small 28 millimeter blades are great for freehand cutting, cutting out fabric patterns, for instance, which have some curves along the way, or if you're cutting out something for applique, you might want to use a small bladed tool. A downside of the small 28 millimeters is they're a little harder to find. There aren't as many handles that use them, and their blades are actually at the same cost or maybe potentially even a little more expensive than the 45 millimeter blades, the mid-size. And it's because it's a little more specific. It's not as general. So moving up to that 45 millimeter, that mid-size blade, this is what I would say is the Goldilocks size. It's the size that is great for everything. It's going to be good at long straight curves, but also it's going to be good at making generally rough rounded curves. It's not quite as good as the small, but it's pretty good at it. So you can still cut out patterns for a dress. You could cut out a pattern. You could also use it for your long straight quilt cuts. And the blades are generally the least expensive because they can come in bulk packs. You can get them in 5 packs, or often, sometimes you can get them in 10 packs. And by piece price, they become kind of the least expensive. But there are people that like to use the 60 millimeter, the even larger, the largest size, for a couple reasons. There's one good reason behind it is they have a lot of visibility around the axle. Because there's so much blade exposed, you might be in a situation where you have a lot of batting. If you're making kind of the final cuts on your quilts and you've stacked up all your quilted layers with the batting inside, and you're going to, put your edging on, and you're going to make long cuts that are nice and straight, but they're thick. And so having a larger blade will give you better visibility between that cut edge and the axle itself. Whereas if you use something a little bit smaller, you don't quite have that same amount of distance between that axle and the material you're cutting. A downside to the 60 millimeter blade, though, is it's even worse at cutting curves. It really is great for those long cuts, like I mentioned, cutting the final cuts on your quilt, or if you're cutting out quilt blocks that are all straight lines, that 60 millimeter will work quite nicely. Another downside is these blades, being bigger, are a little more expensive. So it's just a trade-off that you've got to make of, like, do you like the extra visibility of having the longer blade around the axle, or do you like having something a little less expensive? So those are kind of the 3 major sizes. The 28 millimeters, the smallest, great for curvy lines and for cutting straight. The 45, which is kind of that jack of all trades, can do everything pretty well. Or the 60, which is really just for those straight lines, really can't do much curving, but has that little more visibility between the axle and the blade. So that's for the blades. And as you see, I keep holding up this kind of handle, each of these handles, but there's another kind. So for instance, you've got a handle that looks a little bit different. Even though these are both 45 millimeter blades, there's majorly 2 different versions of handles. Those that are called straight, or stick in a lot of cases, these straight handles, or bent handles. So a bent handle like this has often a loop along the bottom, but it doesn't always. But in the Fiskars tools, that bent handle allows a little more ergonomic positioning of your hands. And let me switch to a slightly different view. So in this overhead view, you can see my material is going to be down here, and I'm going to be cutting. And so if I pick up this rotary cutter, this straight handled one, and you have to orient your wrist up, your wrist ends up with this kind of kink in it, and because you have to point the blade down into the material, into the mat that you're going to be cutting against. And that might get uncomfortable over time, so the bent has a handle that is turned relative to where your blade would go, so you can hold it with a little less wrist flex. That wrist can be a little bit straighter, so it can feel more ergonomic. It can let you work for a little bit longer. Now there is a downside to this, and that downside to the loop rotary cutter versus the straight rotary cutter is that when you have a straight rotary cutter, you can use it with your right hand, or you could use it with your left hand, and the visibility is the same. The access to the blade is the same. It's essentially symmetric left and right. If you have a bent rotary cutter, now when you are looking at the blade and you're cutting with your right hand, it works nicely. But if you go to move with your left hand, now the blade's on the back. It's away from you. It's hard to see. Now, if it's just you using this tool and you only ever use your left hand, it is easy enough to take the blade and switch it to the opposite side. And this is designed to be able to be used by lefties or righties. So now it's positioned correctly. The downside is now if I'm using it with right and left hand, or I have different people that are sharing this rotary cutter at a quilting meetup or something, that swapping back and forth is not as convenient. So that might be a reason you might want this straight or stick, because it can be swapped back and forth between someone who's a lefty and someone who's a righty. So while at the same time you gain a little bit of ergonomic benefit from that bent or the loop rotary cutter, you might have a situation where you want to trade off, in which case it might be better to go with the stick. So those are the primary two versions of handles that we're looking at. Now, if you remember, the three different types of components was the blades. We talked about the three sizes. Handles, we now have talked about two different types of handles. And the third one was the safety features. So let's talk about those safety features next. And they really come down to how you are protecting yourself from that blade. Because as I mentioned, those blades are very sharp. And there's really two ways to protect yourself from the blade. One is you have a guard that moves out of the way. So you can see this guard is orange, it's nice and bright. And as you pull a trigger, that guard slides right into the handle, slides out of the way. And now you've got a tool that is able to cut. While the guard is in place, you've got a big orange flag on the top. You can see that it's in a safe position, and it's nice and easy to slide down with your thumb. Usually your thumb is right here. You can slide it up and down. But that then protects the blade when you're not using it. The other method of protecting the blade is, instead of moving a guard, actually moving the blade itself. And you can see from the animation, but also from my little picture in here, pushing the trigger up on the top of the loop handle or the bent handle extends the blade out, and you can see that blade extends out far enough for you to do the cut. And then you push a little button here and it's spring loaded and it pops right back into place and it becomes safe, it becomes protected. A lot of people prefer this tool, the moving blade, because it feels a little easier to remember to make it safe again. By just pushing this button, you get a satisfying click, that feeling of, all right, now it's safe. Now if I set it down, I won't have my cat accidentally jump up on the table and cut themselves, or if I leave the room and my child or my grandchild comes in, they won't accidentally cut themselves. Whereas with a moving guard, often you have to manually remember to move it back. Now, it is nice, the Fiskars has a bright orange flag right up there on the top, so you can just at a glance tell if it's safe or not. But it's just a kind of a preference thing, whether you want that moving guard or that moving blade. All right, so we've talked about the three main components. Let's start to put some of these together and look and see which one we'd choose. So again, we've got this view of a bunch of different rotary cutters. And let's say we want a tiny rotary cutter, but we like the stick handle, and because it's a little smaller, maybe it stores a little bit easier in the drawer, and you like that moving guard because it's easy to see. Well, we have that tool right here. And this is that tool that is the stick, and it's got a moving guard, and it's the smallest 18 millimeter. And this is a great tool to have not just in your sewing cabinet, but also potentially in a junk drawer. It's safe, you're not going to be able to get to the blade. It's small, it's lightweight, it's easy to store somewhere. So it might be kind of a good junk drawer tool to have for even if you just wanted to cut open a package against your cutting board even, or the mats, which we will talk about after. But in this case, you've got this small blade, stick handle, moving guard. So let's say we instead want a big handle, or a big blade, the 60 millimeter blade and a loop handle, but we still, then in this case, that's the one that we like. You can see it's got the loop handle where your fingers can fit inside there, and it's a little easier to hold. When you push the trigger, it moves the blade up and it exposes it for you to be able to use it. And it's got the large 60 millimeter blade. So now, understanding those things, we've got an option for that. What if we want kind of that more average size, the 45 millimeters, again, bent like the other? here's a great option. What's nice about some of these is there are going to be multiple things that satisfy it. In this case, you can see there's some nice decorative handled ones. We call them fashionable, or we have multiple different colors, and I believe this is a lilac, ultra lilac, and this is a beautiful purple color that comes out there, and it can pop from across the table, and it really, if you want, you could match the decor of the room with this. With multiple different colors out there, you should be able to pick which kinds you like. Or there is even some that have, in the far right, you can see the one with the gray. That's a soft grip. And I can point that out again. It's not squishy, but it's a little bit tackier to enhance your grip on this thing, so it doesn't slip around in your hand. It gives you more confidence that you're holding it well. It's not going to slip out of your hand. And that's maybe a little bit of a more expensive or more advanced version of it, but it's still going to satisfy that 45 millimeters, bent handle, moving blade, but it's got some little extra features. So understanding those basics of a rotary cutter, those would be the situations where, if you go to the shelf, you could help you guide your decision of what to buy. But there are some other cool tools, I call them cool tools, out there that might have additional features for helping you do certain things that might attract your attention. And I can point out some of those things you might see them on the shelves to help you understand why they're there. And the first I'll point out is when you come to the shelves, the ones that have that gray soft grip, they're a little bit nicer, have an additional feature called out on there. And they say titanium right on there. And what that titanium means is that our rotary blades, which are already razor sharp, have a special titanium coating on them that makes them harder than steel and last longer, so that they're more durable than a regular rotary blade. So you could cut lots and lots of layers and lots of quilts and not have to replace them. Now, the titanium isn't magic. It's not going to stop it from getting damaged if you run over a pin that you forgot to remove. But it will, in its regular wear and tear of a blade, make it go for a significantly longer time without wearing out. So fewer blade changes, less blade handling, less expensive when it's got that titanium coating on it. So look for that little flag on the package that says titanium. They do look pretty much the same. It's the same shininess, because titanium and steel are both a shiny silver metal. So it's kind of hard to look and see that difference. But within the packaging, like I said, you can see that word titanium coating on there, and that'll enhance the durability of those rotary blades. There's another cool tool, and it's very similar. I keep holding it up, but there's a secret going on with the way that this blade is held in place. It's got a special easy blade change, and let me demonstrate that. So the way the easy blade change works is, if you've ever had to change the blade, a typical rotary cutter. I'll demonstrate just a typical rotary cutter first for those of you that haven't. You have a little nut on the back that you turn just with your thumbs, and then you remove it all the way. And then there is a black bolt. You can see some threads there. You push it, and it comes out the top, and you can see the orange cap is there too. And now the blade is loose on the top. So that blade can come out. If you need to replace it, you can wrap it in some duct tape or put it in a cardboard box and then recycle it or throw it away. And when you go to put the new one on, you place it right on top. You put the axle through it in the same way it was before, and then you put the nut back on. Now, one of the problems with these rotary cutter blade changes is that whole removing it from the rotary cutter and having to touch it and being worried. So the easy blade change rotaries have a few cool features. The first is, while this looks nice and sleek and you get lots of visibility around the axle, there's a special flap that if you pull it, it pulls a little handle out. And that handle lets you push slightly down and turn a quarter turn. And now when you pick it up, there's a magnet built inside of it. So the magnet lets you pick that blade up, and you're not even touching it. And what's great is then there's also a feature that if you put this against a tabletop and push down, the blade falls off. So if you were to put it into a box and push down, that blade falls off and you don't even have to touch it. And then later, if you're going to put a new one down, it's something similar, that if you get it in a container or a packaging that has the right kind of opening through the center axle, which I can demonstrate here. So if it's got an opening through it, now you don't even have to touch the blade to put the new one back in place. So it's a very cool feature that's new for these rotary cutters for 2023 that allow you to make this very easy blade change. It's very quick and easy to just put the new ones back on. And it's a game changer, I think, for a lot of people, because you don't even have to touch the blade. You don't have to put it on the table and slide it to the edge and then pick it up from the edge. It's all taking place with the magic of magnets. It just comes right off. And so that's very cool. I keep holding this one up. There's another secret thing that's going on inside this rotary cutter. This is new to the world, called the Duo Loop rotary cutter. And I have it in package here. You can see it says Duo Loop on the top. And if you flip it over, it says 2 rotary cutters in 1. And how does that make any sense? And the video is kind of spoiling it there at the bottom. But the Duo Loop rotary cutter can hold a 60mm rotary blade, just as you would normally see a regular 60mm rotary blade. But when you do this quick easy blade change, you see there's 2 holes through it. There's 2 different holes for axles, because in the container comes another axle that you can put down and add it at the bottom, and it uses a 45mm blade. And now when you push it down, it can expose that blade that same amount as the other, but you got this extra 45mm that's built in addition to the 60mm. So you can swap those out. This is the first time this has ever been out, and this is very exciting, because we do hear people that want to have just one handle, but sometimes they use 60mm, sometimes they use 45. So this is a way to keep them both while still only using one handle. Included in the packaging is a little storage container. That storage container can hold the 60 blade and axle while you're using the 45, or while you're using the 60, it can hold the 45 right in there, nice and safe, so it doesn't come out, and you never have to touch the blade. So this is kind of a great new innovation that Fiskars came out with, to be able to have 2 tools in one. Again, that is called the Duo Loop rotary cutter, and it came with the little container for it right in there. So that's an exciting new one. Another new feature that is more new to Fiskars is increasing the blade clearance. So a lot of people have rotary cutters that look like this. This is the Fiskars rotary cutter that we've been selling for 10 years, 15 years, this model. It's very classic. It works very well. It is, in this case, a 45mm blade, stick handle, moving guard. And you can see that just slides up and down, just kind of like the other one. Instead of orange, it was gray, and it's a little harder to tell that's there. But the new version has this orange flag at the top to help you see it's safe, a little easier. But the other cool feature is when you extend or retract the blades, you can tell the new version over here, the blade, you can see a little more blade along the edge. And as you compare those in the cutting angles, you can see you get a couple extra millimeters of blade exposure for you to cut that extra thick batting, for you to be able to have clearance if you've got an extra tall stack of fabrics that you're trying to cut. So that was kind of an extra little feature that we put on all of the new rotary cutters. So whether it's the 28 has that same amount of additional blade exposure, or the 60 has additional blade exposure too, and that's mainly by putting flatter edges right along here rather than a larger curve, you get that extra blade exposure. Oh, those are just new for the new 2023 Fiskars rotary cutters, but I wanted to kind of point it out here and show that that was new and unique. All right, so I've talked a lot about rotary cutters, but if you haven't used them before, you might wonder, oh, can I cut this just on my regular tabletop? Aren't they really, really sharp? And in reality, rotary cutters are just one part of a system of tools, especially if you're making a quilt with these. They really do consist of the rotary cutter plus a ruler plus the cutting mat. That sewing ruler sometimes is optional depending on what you're using with it, but that cutting mat is never optional. When you're cutting on a bare tabletop, you're going to damage the tabletop and probably damage the blade itself. So you always want to be cutting on a cutting mat, specially made for rotary cutters. So cutting mats in general are just these flexible little plastic mats. They do come in a variety of sizes. The smallest, the most portable one is essentially a 12 by 18. There is a specialty that's a little smaller. I'll talk about that in a second, but this is kind of the most portable. But you know, if you had a 24-inch ruler or a bolt of fabric that needed a 24-inch cut, this wouldn't quite be long enough. If you go on the diagonal, it's really close, but the advantage that this one gives is that portability. They do go all the way up to this, they go to 2 foot by 3 foot. I mean, this is almost bigger than my camera view here. This is a 24-inch by 36-inch. And this will be able to cut anything you set on it. It's also a great surface to work on when you're doing pinning, when you won't accidentally stab through things. It's got a good surface texture. Each of these rotary cutters are also double-sided, so they're light with dark or dark with light, if that's something you want. And all of them are special for rotary cutting because we say they tend to self-heal. Now, I want to be a little engineering about this in that they will not perfectly close up, but the material that these are made of are a kind that if you cut them, they flex outward to let the blade slice through, but then they push back together. They don't physically close, they don't chemically close back up, but they close enough that it's really hard to see any sort of cut after you've made that cut. Now, there are other types of cutting mats out there that are not what you would call this self-healing, even though the self-healing is kind of still a misnomer, but the Fiskars vinyl cutting mats are going to be the ones that close the best. So you'll have the least amount of damage apparent. This is especially important if you're doing a whole bunch of blocks, for instance, that are all getting cut at, say, the 10-inch mark or the 12-inch mark, and you always cutting at exactly that same point. If you're going over and over the same point a whole lot of times, you might start to actually see the damage. So having one that tends to close back up is especially important. Additionally, if you shift to the 13, then shift to the 14, sometimes that can help to increase the life of your mat. But again, it's also double-sided, so if you do start to get a little too much damage in one spot, you can rotate it or flip it and get new spots to be able to cut with. There is these other ones up in the corner that I've pointed out that I called the folding mats. And I even have a slide for those because they're especially cool. The folding mats are full-size mats. There's two different sizes. One is it's an 18 by 24. This folds in half to become a 12 by 18 for portability. But we also have this great big one. This is one of the large size versions that folds in thirds. But when you have it fully out, it's the size of that largest one. But when you're going to move it somewhere, it folds in thirds and it becomes a lot more portable and easy to use. There's a couple interesting features about them. One is you might notice there's a wavy edge, that seam that you would cut. If you imagine if that were just a straight seam, if you're cutting a straight line and you get close to it, you might drift off. Excuse me. Might drift into that seam and be off the cut line. So you don't want that. Excuse me. By making it a wavy edge, you'll never fall into that seam and divert away from your straight line. So by making it that wavy edge, we've made it so that you don't fall into that seam. The other thing that we add is a non-slip foam layer in the back. This means that when you set it out on the table, it won't slip around. The double-sided mats have an advantage to that they are double-sided. You can flip it over and have a new surface. But the downside is they're not too, they slip a bit, especially on very smooth tables like this is a wood tabletop that I've got here. They slip around. So the foam on the rear of these folding ones mean that they don't slip around and they stay in place when you put them there. So that's a reason that you might want to use these interesting folding mats. Now, while rotary mats are always necessary, many tasks also want the use of a ruler. And so Fiskars does sell quilting and sewing rulers that are transparent and are a little thicker than what you might see from most rulers. Now, the reason you would want a thicker ruler, because in a lot of cases, when you're cutting, you're going to line the edge of your ruler up with the straight line that you're cutting, and then your rotary blade can just press against the side of the ruler as it's cutting, and you're going to guarantee a nice straight cut at that point. The thicker it is, the less tendency the blade has to hop up on top of the ruler. And so we have our nice thick acrylic rulers in a variety of sizes, ranging from a smaller 8.5 by 8.5 all the way up to a 16 by 24, or sorry, 6 by 24. This will cut your, a folded 45-inch bolt. It'll cut that in a single cut all the way through, so you don't have to reposition that ruler. And it's nice and thick. You can measure the 6 inches this way or the 24-inch this way. So a variety of rulers. There is one tool, a cool tool, and it's, I think, the final slide I have, that tends to integrate both the need for a ruler and a rotary cutter kind of all at the same time. Because whenever you're cutting with a rotary cutter on a straight edge, you want it to follow the edge of the ruler, but you don't want it to come up. So we at Fiskars thought, well, what if we designed a ruler that had a built-in rotary cutter attached to the side? So this is called the rotary cutter and ruler combo tool. I had a box. Oh, it's over there. I won't go get it. Essentially, this is a 6 by 24-inch ruler that has a rotary cutter attached to the side. So when you place it and line it up with what you want to cut, you would just push down on this blade, and by pushing on the handle, it pushes the blade down into the fabric, and then it slides all the way down and back, whichever direction you're cutting with, and it makes that cut very easy. So this is a very handy tool to use because it feels very safe. It never comes off. You can't slip. And it's just a lot easier to kind of push down with a little more weight if you need more weight, because you can use just the palm of your hand rather than holding it with your hand. So this is a very interesting, very cool tool for you to be able to cut long straight lines with and not need to have those two tools. It does also feature similar to the other one, where if you remove the nut, there's a magnet built into the guard. And so that guard removes the blade, and you can then do a blade replacement that way, and without really having to touch the blade that way either. So that's a handy tool as well. It has a handy feature there. So with all that being said, we finished, there we go, 35 minutes. Sounds just about right, and that gives us a little bit of time for some questions. I have not been monitoring the chat. I do see there are 42 messages in the chat. So if anyone wants to chime in with additional questions from the chat, I'm happy to answer anything that hasn't been mentioned before. Looks like Tiffany's been doing it.
I have been answering most of them, but we did get one question specifically for you. So it says, from Kathy, I'm curious what, from an engineering perspective, what you think are the biggest and best of the changes to the rotary cutter since its initial launch?
Okay, yeah, of course. I'm happy to talk about those things. There are 3 things I would say that are the biggest and best changes to the rotary cutters since they came out in the 1980s. And the first thing that I think is really great is this easy blade change. And I've talked about it a couple times, but for the entire time, I've been with Fiskars 13 years, and I've made 5 different models of rotary cutters in that time, and we've always kind of tried to make it easier to change these blades. But I feel like finally we've gotten this blade mechanism just feels like the easiest to use and the best method to change these blades without ever having to touch them. You can just, like I showed before, you can place you flip up the little tab. It's not on a blade anymore. The magnet holds the blade in place. You place it onto the tabletop and you push down on it, and the blade just falls right off there. So you don't have to pull it off the handle. And I've never seen anyone like that where it integrates the removal of the blade from the rotary cutter and then a feature to remove the blade from the tool moved it with. So that's that first real amazing feature. The second one, I think, really comes down to that duo loop. That was another thing that we really heard a lot of, and this is new to the Fiskars rotary cutters, new to any rotary cutters at this point, to have the ability to use two different sizes of blades on the same handle. And to me, that's I think answering a question that we've heard a lot is like, I want more storage space. My sewing room is always full. How can I just have one fewer tool in there? And this is the answer to that question. So I'd say those are the two. And then the last one that's kind of just an extra one is I really like the extra little bit of flair that we added to this to really be able to show you if this is safe or not. From a distance, especially if you've got a cluttered tabletop like I do, sometimes it's hard to see if a stick rotary cutter is safe or not. And that extra little flag at the top really makes it easy to tell, is it safe or not? All right. Oh, I do see a question that can the blades be sharpened? Now, I do get this question frequently because blade sharpeners, rotary blade sharpeners do exist on the market, but Fiskars does not make any. And the reason for that was hinted by what I said early on. Rotary blades are about the sharpest blades out there. They're sharper than craft knives, they're sharper than your scissors. And it's very, very difficult to get rotary blades anywhere close to factory sharpness, anywhere close. And when I mean like anywhere close, I don't mean like half. I mean, if you try and use a rotary sharpener, which we have in our test lab, I've never seen it do anything but make it worse. And that's why Fiskars has never had a rotary sharpener, because it's so incredibly difficult to get them to that sharpness that we can never expect a tool that you're going to purchase and use at home to be able to bring them back up to anywhere close to that sharpness. So never recommend sharpening those blades. If you have the 45 millimeters, it's often good to just kind of buy a bulk pack and then have some on hand so that if you're in mid-project, you don't have to run to the store to get something else. So I hope that answers it. And I'm sorry that we don't have a way to sharpen them. It would be amazing, but their function is needs to be so incredibly sharp that there's really no way to sharpen them. Okay. Oh, I see a question on how to flatten your mat if it gets out of shape. Well, I think I'll start by talking about how the mats can get wavy. So these mats, the rotary mats, or the Fiskars rotary cutter mats, these are a type of plastic that, in order to have that kind of closure feature where after you make a cut it closes, means they're often a little more sensitive to heat than most plastics. And rotary mats, if they're left in a hot car, they'll tend to warp. If you try and iron on them, even for just a little bit of time, they will tend to warp. They are made of several layers of different types of plastics, special plastics. And so if you heat one of the top layers and not the bottom layers, it can tend to warp. Or if you put it in direct sun and it heats the top layers and doesn't heat the bottom layers, it'll tend to warp. And so it's going to get to the point where, you know, any major heat disruption is going to cause a little bit of distortion. Now, unfortunately, that's a permanent deformation. That's not something that we can just say, oh, just flex it the other way. I've not heard a surefire way to fix that. So I'm going to speak as a Dan Cunningham, not as a Fiskars person, but if you have a really major issue with it, you can attempt to very gently iron the back. Don't iron the top that it's warped towards, but iron the side that is away from that, and it'll tend to help. But again, that is not the official Fiskars. That's just, hey, me trying to be a helpful engineer. But otherwise, you know, the official term is once it's really distorted, you really can't do much about it. So you should buy a new one. But more importantly is just try and keep them away from major heat sources. You know, don't put them in hot cars. Don't iron on them as much as you think you want to. It's going to cause problems like that. All right. Okay, there's a question here from Corey. What is the significance of the scalloped blade rotary cutters? I have seen those, and there are there's two different versions, and I don't know if you're talking about true scallops, which are sharp corners and then rounded tops, or pinking rotary blades. Those have more of a zigzag. Pinking rotary blades, and in its own way, scalloped rotary blades, will probably help with fraying at edges. So if you're cutting an edge off a fabric with, say, a regular pair of scissors, sometimes those can tend to have the threads come out, especially if it's not washed. Those threads can start to come out. So you could use a pinking shears, which has a zigzag cutter, to help stop those frayed threads from coming out. The pinking rotary blade is going to do the same thing. It's going to be able to cut an edge and give a zigzag. In the same way, scalloping is going to do something similar. I do think that a scalloped might be just a more decorative version of that to give a more decorative edge, like a pinking shear. But I'm not actually, I'm not quite as aware of what the scalloped might be other than just kind of a pinking. Okay, question from, a Sue question that just came up. She's never used a rotary cutter. Can they be used to cut other things other than fabric? Absolutely, with one caveat, that if you are going to cut things other than fabric, you should probably isolate that blade. If you're going to cut things like paper or cardboards, they're going to work really well, but they will tend to wear out your blades a little bit more. One thing I have found is cutting with rotary blades onto paper, they can be older blades. They can be a little bit duller blades, and they're still going to cut papers and cardboards and other things just as well, but maybe they won't work as well on fabric. So if you have a rotary blade that you've used on paper, keep it for paper. If you have blades that you've used only on fabric, those are your fabric blades. A lot of ways, people use scissors the same way. They have their paper scissors and they're special. Nobody touch these. These are my sewing scissors. So you can kind of keep those isolated. But one of my favorite go-to tools when I'm cutting out, say, illustration board, or if I'm making mats for picture frames, I use a rotary cutter to cut through that heavy fabric. The heavy paper. It works a lot better than most other scissors even to get that really clean edge. But then those blades get set aside and used only for those paper. So I hope that helps. All right, let me scroll back up through. It looks like Tiffany's been very good at answering a lot of the questions here. So I think it looks like there's some love the new blade change and the folding mats. Those are great. So I think unless I see any other questions, I think this is great, and we've got 45 minutes, and I'm happy to have hosted and answered all the questions that you have. So thank you for your time. It was wonderful to speak and be able to show off all of these 2023 new rotary cutters that Fiskars is coming out with, and the whole system with the rotary mats and the rulers. And so I hope you learned something. Thank you very much.